just simply participating in that routine, the development of executive functioning is just a byproduct. There's no explicit teaching. First of all, we can't burden teachers with that because they don't have enough time in the first place. So where would they fit lessons and curriculum on developing executive functions? There's already a time crunch.
Executive functioning isn't just something that's nice to have. It's essential. Skills like organization, time management, and goal setting are what help students succeed, not just in school, but in life. So why aren't we helping people learn them with more intentionality? Today, I'm talking with Mitch Weathers. He's an educator, author, and the creator of Organized Binder, a system that helps students build these critical skills with simple, hands-on routines. He's here to talk about the real-world, hands-on tools that build executive functioning from the ground up. That's straight ahead on episode 266. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Whether you are neurodivergent or your child is, if you've ever had to look for a mental health therapist who understands how to support their clients through a neurodiversity-affirming lens, you probably had a hard time finding one. There aren't a lot of us out there, although that is beginning to change. I know the way I approach working with my clients now, compared to when I first began my counseling practice, has changed. And I truly believe that integrating neurodiversity-affirming practices has been life-changing for the clients I support. I know for a fact that we need more clinicians out there who understand neurodivergent clients, and we're working to bring this understanding and knowledge to clinicians worldwide. On April 25th, we are offering a free 1-hour continuing education webinar for mental health practitioners and other professionals who support neurodivergent people. The topic is The Cost of Camouflage, Exploring Masking and Burnout in Neurodivergent Clients. If you'd like to register or you want to pass along the information to someone else who might want to attend, you can go to neurodiversity.university and click on the tab for the Therapist Hub, or just click the link in the show notes. Okay, Mitch Weathers is here with me in a minute.
Hey there, educators. Since you're listening to this podcast, we know you're passionate about unlocking the potential of every student. That's why we started the Neurodiversity University and developed our course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. It was created by the host of this podcast, Emily Kircher-Morris, who's a former educator who works with school districts, organizations, and companies to help them understand and serve people with learning differences. This course gives you the tools to help students of all neurotypes, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and more, thrive. It's available for in-house professional development, site licenses for districts, and independent study for teachers and parents. Go to neurodiversity.university or call us at 929-445-8255. Look for a link in the show notes.
Today, I'm talking with Mitch Weathers, an educator, author, and expert in executive functioning. Mitch is the founder of Organized Binder, a research-based system that helps students build the kinds of skills we know are essential for long-term success, things like organization, time management, goal setting, and reflection. He wrote the book, Executive Functions, for every classroom. He's all about giving students hands-on analog tools to help them build resilience and independence, even in a world that is increasingly digital. So, Mitch, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Emily. Excited to be here.
Executive functioning is often seen as a nice to have, something to focus on after the academic content is covered or when a student is already struggling. What do we miss as educators and parents and adults who support kids when we don't treat executive functioning as essential?
That's a really good starting place. If you don't see it as essential, and I always refer to it as, and I talk about this in my book, the order of operations. It's not to say that the things, the standards, the objectives, the stuff for teaching and learning is not important. But if you don't first lay the foundation for learning, and that sense of agency and resilience in students. We're missing something there, and yet, so it's not that it's one is more important than the other. It's just an order of operations. One needs to happen for the other one to be more successful. And of course, the issue there is, how do you do that if I'm a fourth grade teacher and I have this curriculum that I'm like content and standards that I'm tasked with teaching this year? I don't really have to, what do I take the whole first month or two of the school year and teach executive functioning? So it's got to be done in a concurrent sense, but really at that tier 1 or level 1, so that all students are getting practice and exposure to these skills and habits within the context or in conjunction with what they're learning. Mm-hmm. But by seeing it essential and not as a tier 2, if you will, or a tier 3, is you're being more proactive and less reactive. So what I like to think of executive function as a tier 1 resource for a school that every student, all students get practice with and exposure to these skills and habits. And a true tier 1 or level 1 for our friends in New Mexico should be able to identify areas of need or concern, and at times, not always, but at times address or mitigate those in the tier 1 space, so that if you have a persistent concern or need, then it is elevated to that tier 2 or maybe even tier 3 intervention. And in the absence of a tier 1, you're going to overtax the system. And we've all heard the saying that you can't tier 2 yourself out of a tier 1 problem. Mm-hmm. So when we look at it, back to your question about being essential, and that what I hear in that is there's certain things that are essential to what we're doing here at school. When we add that to the list, then we're more likely to be proactive and more likely to expose students to these skills and habits that aren't academic in nature. They just happen to be the factors that develop that sense of agency and dexterity in our students.
Yeah. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, this is related to kind of that response to intervention piece.
Correct.
That a lot of schools use to identify kids who are struggling, who need more support. So a tier 1 is the support that we give all students in the classroom. And then if there are concerns, a student who needs more support, then they might kind of move to a tier 2 or a tier 3, representing that they're getting more targeted support in any particular area, academic or otherwise. I think this is important, though, because we talk a lot about how a neurodiversity affirming environment is not just good for neurodivergent kids, it's good for all kids. And that's really what you're talking about here. You're talking about how these are skills that everybody needs. Mm-hmm. And there are some kids who kind of perhaps pick it up more automatically, but giving that explicit instruction and really telling kids like how they can do it and walking them through this is a vital component of this process for them to develop those skills.
I unpack what I call the 3 keys for teaching executive functions in my book, and I start by saying, they're actually not taught in the traditional sense of the word. Mm. They're best learned when students clearly see them modeled. The analog organized binder, you can see it. It's color-coded, it's tactile, it's tangible. When they clearly see them modeled and they get daily practice employing or using these skills as a byproduct of engaging in a predictable routine. So there's 3 keys: clarity, modeling, and routine. And to that word you used, making it very explicit for students. And when you look back historically, we've kind of hoped that students just pick these skills and habits up by chance. We haven't, made them essential or explicit in our instruction and in our class. Like, this is just part of what we do here at this school or in this district. And so that's where that clarity piece comes in, giving students practice with them while seeing it model. So. Mm-hmm.
I remember growing up, the strategy for teaching executive functioning skills for somebody who really struggled with it, like me, was to discipline those kids. Yeah. Like, you didn't do the thing, and so now you're in trouble for this. And it's like, I don't know that I could have articulated it then or even in my early teaching career, but now I look back and I'm like, I don't know that they knew how to teach those skills. I feel like
that's a good point.
That analysis, that this is something that can be taught and learned, I feel like that is something that we've come to recognize and implement recently than, I don't know, maybe even when I first started my teaching career in the very early 2000s.
I would agree with you, Emily, entirely. And I've seen a shift since 2020 in the pandemic. I've said this a lot, but I think one silver lining, at least when it comes to executive functioning, is that there seems to be a collective shift towards, oh yeah, we do actually need to teach these. And I'm kind of on the mission saying, true, but they're not taught. So if you're trying to do it through a curriculum, that's not how these skills are learned. I need to practice them in a messy way, but within the context or grade level, like where I'm at developmentally and the things I'm learning at back to that 5th grade or 12th grade or wherever it might be. When we talk about developing executive functioning skills, context really matters.
Right. When I worked as a school counselor, I would go in and do these 30-minute guidance lessons in classrooms, and I would do lessons on things like executive functioning. But that's exactly what you're saying. It's like, that's just the tip of the iceberg to introduce the concept. But where the learning happens is through the practice. And we know this when we think about other academics. I mean, you don't just sit there and tell a student about how to do a math problem. You have them walk through and do the math problem over and over and over again until they really grasp that concept and can apply it. And so this is kind of the same way.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything in life when it comes to learning that's not the case?
Right.
Given a talk or a keynote or something, kind of covering this point. I grew up playing competitive soccer, and I tell the story. At one point, I was probably in middle school or something, and I decided I wanted to juggle the ball 100 times on my head without the soccer ball falling. And then I'll ask the audience, what's the only way to learn to juggle a soccer ball on your head 100 times? Practice juggling the ball. And it's that repetition in a no stakes way, which is important. It doesn't matter if that soccer ball dropped. I'm not doing it in the middle of a game. Maybe that would have been problematic. There'd be problems there. But, it's just over and over and over. And then there was one day I remember being in practice, waiting in line for a drill. And I had gotten in the habit, instead of just waiting there, until my turn, I would keep trying to juggle the ball on my head. And it dawned on me that I was like way over 100. I'd gotten to a point where I would stop when I wanted to stop.
Yeah.
Didn't make me a better soccer player. It's nothing about that. It was just repetition over time. And when you talk about students learning to get and stay organized, practice it every single day while it's being modeled.
Yeah.
How do I start planning and time management and time blocking? And I got to see how it's done, and I got to practice it every single day. And pretty soon they evolve, Emily, this is my opinion. They become transferable competencies where now it's mine, and I can be in a different context or a different grade level or a different learning environment or after school, in college or in work. And I have some, back to that dexterity with this skill, because it's mine. I can take it into a new context and employ it.
I think a lot of us can recognize when a student is struggling with these types of skills, but sometimes it's harder to understand why they're struggling with those skills. I'm curious if you have any ideas about why executive functioning skills are so underdeveloped in a lot of kids and teens today, even if they're not necessarily neurodivergent.
Really good question and really interesting topic. I'll start by saying, if it truly is in that tier level 1, all kids getting practice, it's less of a concern because students start to get practice and develop these skills. No question about it. Why they're underdeveloped, there's a lot of opinions on this. Of course, you alluded to this. Do some kids just pick them up a little bit easier? Are we hardwired as individuals in certain ways? And all of that, I think, is absolutely true. I think students' lived experience can influence or be a factor in developing executive functions. And I'm pretty convinced, I'll say, I have not done an empirical study on this, but I think it's pretty obvious the digital era for kids is not helping with the development of executive functioning skills.
Yeah.
And not to say that we can't have technology. I'm not here to make that argument, and I'm not trying to, but I think you're seeing in classrooms in particular, I'm hearing from more and more teachers at a younger and younger age that they just struggle with executive function. They, self-regulated learning, task initiation, task completion, not that things like that haven't been an issue in classrooms historically, but it seems to be a growing concern.
Mm-hmm.
I believe screens have an influence on that. And, I've been asked about my work, well, when's it going to be made an app? And I always reply and say, never will it be an app. And I'm not against apps, but I say, you got to understand that apps are built to do things for us. They're applications. Mm-hmm. And that's fantastic. But if I take away the clarity, modeling, and routine, I rob that young person of the potential to develop these executive functioning skills and make them their own. I don't want that done for you.
Yeah. You've mentioned them a couple of times, but I want to talk about these 3 key components for teaching executive functioning that you outline. You've mentioned clarity, modeling, and routine. So specifically, can you walk us through those a little bit and talk about how they can be implemented, not just in the classroom, but also if there are parents who are listening who want to try to put these into place at home, how can they use these tools as well?
Great question. And I was actually going to mention the parenting piece. What I am about to unpack with clarity, modeling, and routine is very much a classroom, doesn't have to be a traditional classroom environment, but that teaching, learning paradigm context. And that can be a homeschool environment. That could be an independent study environment where the student's mostly working and doing things at home. Where I've seen it break down for parents and families is if they're trying to teach executive functioning skills at home, like after school. It oftentimes, Emily, the reports I've received back is that it just turns into a battle of wills between the young person and their parents, because I've gone to school all day and I'm coming home. Maybe I have some homework. Ideally, the kids should probably go outside and do something, Now I'm going to sit down and practice goal setting and look at the table of contents and get ourselves organized. And it can just, not that it can't happen, but I've just seen it kind of turn into a battle. And so for our work, a really critical component, and parents, please hear this, is the support piece. So the practice and the 3 keys I'm going to unpack for you in just a second is happening at school. And we have a bilingual guide for families that goes home, and it invites the family into the process. And so there's an accountability piece there, kind of a co-accountability with the family, which is fantastic. But also just inviting them into, hey, if you want to see what's your students' reflections every day or the goals they're setting this quarter with their daily tasks they're going to try to do every day, maybe you could check in with them about that. And, here's their table of contents where they're practicing organization. And find me a parent that's not going to be excited about a teacher or a school that is addressing the whole learner, the whole child developmentally. So I digress, but that is for parents. I wanted you to hear that. But the 3 keys, think of it this way: establishing a predictable daily routine. So, and very simple, right? How do we begin? How do we make transitions? Where do we put our stuff? How do we conclude? Some of the, just this routine to the day. Establishing a predictable routine, which is part of our training and support, and then never, ever straying from it. And I really want to emphasize this. The more consistently predictable a learning environment is, the safer it feels. And in particular for students' lives whose lives outside of school or outside of that learning environment are anything but predictable. It may even skew towards chaos at times. So maybe living in a kind of ongoing low-level fight or flight kind of experience. When they routinely find themselves in a predictable learning environment, it can have an impact on their actual academic success, because we can't forget that inherent to learning is failure. That's just part of the deal. But if I don't feel safe, I'm less likely to take risks that are inherent to learning. But if I do feel safe, and Deborah Meyer, educator, says it best in one of her books, that the ideal scenario is that when the idea of risk, of failure, never even enters a child's mind. Like that's just, we're here learning. And I really believe in that. So that predictable routine. Now, the binder in an organized binder or a portfolio, it's the tool to participate in that routine. And each step of the routine, so as I mentioned, how we begin, how we transition, what's the next step, where do we put our stuff? In our binders, it's all a different color. It's all color coded. So I have a tremendous amount of nonverbal visual cueing happening in the classroom, because what I'm ultimately trying to do is reduce cognitive load. I'm trying to reduce the amount of mental calories students need or students might use just to keep up with instruction or keep up with the class community. So I want to have it just be consistently predictable, always having these nonverbal visual cues, and it's absolute clarity. Just simply participating in that routine, the development of executive functioning is just a byproduct. There's no explicit teaching. First of all, we can't burden teachers with that because they don't have enough time in the first place. So where would they fit lessons and curriculum on developing executive functions? There's already a time crunch. But if it's a byproduct of practicing this routine and I see them modeled every day, it's that repetition over time where students start to make them their own. So it's not hard work for the teacher.
We've been talking a lot about helping kids build some of these skills. This is something that maybe even adults might figure out a way to kind of implement on their own. Like, again, one of the reasons that being a classroom teacher was so hard for me was that as an ADHDer, there was so much executive functioning that was required as a classroom teacher. My first master's is in education, but with a certification in gifted ed, which was a little bit different as far as the executive functioning requirements that were necessary for that type of classroom versus a gen ed classroom. A lot more front-end planning and like novelty that I liked to do, as opposed to some of the back-end clerical types of things that I had to do in the classroom, which I had a hard time with. And so for those teachers who are struggling with their own executive functioning, for those parents who are struggling with theirs, like, are there things, ways that they can implement some of these in their own lives, not only to help the kids, but also just for themselves?
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. So one of the things like I unpack, but I kind of joke about in the book is that in every talk I ever give, I'll introduce executive functioning skills, what they are, and then I'll ask the audience, like, hey, are you working with any kids who struggle with executive dysfunction? Of course, people start laughing and raise their hand, and then I'll say, are any of your colleagues struggling with executive dysfunction? People start laughing. Any of you struggling? And then everyone, raises their hand. And it's one part to be perfectly clear. Of course, we all struggle in certain areas around this idea of executive functioning. What's important is to know those areas of concern or where I'm struggling with executive function that then we can address. But what is really problematic, and this is not to blame anybody, but if a teacher is struggling with executive dysfunction, it can exacerbate the issue for students who are the same in an overwhelmingly kind of sense. So one of the things that I like to make perfectly clear, when we are lucky enough to come in and work with a district or a school and we're training the teachers, like you're practicing this too. Now, you might be someone that sees it, and you mentioned this, like, are some kids just, is it innate? Is it hardwired? Like, why do you pick it up easier than maybe someone else? But that's true of teachers. Some will see this routine, modeling, clarity, and they're like, got it, off to the races. And others, that's why we have training and ongoing support. So we do our implementation training, and then we have prearranged follow-up check-ins, and it's specifically to address areas of concern for teachers, which is helping them. And over the course of the year, and hopefully multiple years, everything's modeled. So teachers are setting quarterly goals with a actionable daily task. Teachers are crafting these prompts. How we begin and conclude is through retrieval practice, where students are constantly flexing their working memories. Well, now teachers are creating a prompt that both kicks off and concludes every lesson of the school year that's in their class sample binder. They're taking time to map out the day and the kind of unit sequence on what we call the agenda, which is like a calendar. So they're practicing time management, task management. Every day we check in on the table of contents. We're all doing it through repetition, those are the really fun emails to receive, or when we receive feedback from teachers and how it's impacting their experience and how it's making them, quote unquote, a better or more effective teacher, because it's helping them address some of these areas of concern when it comes to executive functioning. And I think that the same is true at home. When we talk about clarity, modeling, and routine, that's not academic in nature. So what does that mean? And I like to think of it at my house, like, how are we bringing about clarity, modeling, and routine to those 45 minutes since you all got up and we're having breakfast and we're getting out the door? Or we could talk about screen time and digital. How are families modeling for young people the appropriate use of devices? Is it just, you can only have yours this time, but I'm glued to my phone all day long? I mean, so I think they absolutely transfer it, and it's going to be different in every home. But Paul Tuff wrote a great book called How Children Succeed. And one of my favorite lines from that book is that if we can shape the environment in ways that leads to better executive functioning, then we set students up for success in a particularly efficient way. And the point there is, when we talk about these skills and habits, whether it be in a traditional classroom, at home, an online learning environment, how are we shaping the environment that lead to better executive functioning over time, right? There's an intentionality to that work. Clarity, modeling, routine. So
a lot of the research that I've seen has talked about how, so for example, working memory. One of our guests, Dr. Daniel Ansari, was on here, and he was talking about dyscalculia specifically. But he gave this example where he was talking about building working memory. And there were all of these programs where it's like, oh, well, we can build working memory. We can help kids develop this skill where they can retain more information and manipulate it in their minds. And ultimately, what the research really finally ended up showing was that, yes, you could see improvement on that very specific skill, but it wasn't generalizing. And so when we externalize these processes, especially for our neurodivergent kids, it's not like all of a sudden their working memory is going to be drastically improved, but we're helping them build the systems, or like the hacks that work for their brain. That's really important to realize, because there will be people who they've tried all the things and they just can't do these. There's always a workaround. And sometimes that's what we have to kind of look for a little bit, not necessarily expecting it, again, to be that innate piece. That's like we're just expecting somebody to be able to do it mentally on their own without having these tools surrounding them. Yeah, and I think that familiarity with your own processes and your own self in this also comes from routine practice. It does not mean there can't be accommodations and interventions accordingly for neurodiverse learners. And you're right about working memory. What the research has shown is, I use the word flex your working memory. You're not growing it. Right. You're not increasing capacity per se. But if I get to flex it every day, I get to work with it every day, that's that familiarity. And I start to figure out, like, part of our routine too is every day students are self-assessing and just trying to figure out on a simple scale of 1 through 5, like, where am I in terms of on my journey towards getting this thing, learning this thing. And I love it for a few reasons. Is one, how often are kids getting to self-assess in a no-stakes way? Doesn't matter where you are on the scale. How often do students really get to do that in the modern classroom? And that's problematic, because getting it looks different for all of us. What I like to say, if I'm the one giving the training, is saying, hey, if you have some new pain that you develop, and it's kind of persistent and it hurts enough that you're like, I think I should go to the doctor, and you book an appointment, you go to the doctor, or you go to the ER, maybe it's that bad, and you're meeting with somebody, and they're asking you about your pain, what's the first thing they show you? That little scale. Yeah, the little scale with the faces, right? It's got 10 faces on it, 1 through 10. And 1, you're like smiling, and 10, you're like, I'm on death's door. Yeah. And I've had this happen, and you don't know, because you're not familiar with the pain. And so you're looking at the scale, right? Or I should say, I'm looking at the scale, and I was in the room with both of my children being born, and I'm like, I'm not in that kind of pain. I know that. I'm going to say that's a 9 or 10. You're just making it up, right? So you're like, I'm a 5. Is that okay? Is 5 okay? Because you don't know. And then I share with the teachers that I'm working with that I have a family member who has a chronic pain condition.
lives in pain every day. And if you ask her, you hold up the 10 scales, she'll bring it down to a decimal point. I'm a 6.2 because she's familiar with it. So giving students the opportunity to self-assess, but also to say, if you're a 1 or 2, back to I was saying our scale's a 1 through 5. And of course, every teacher and parent wants you to be a 4 or 5 when you're trying to learn something. But if you're not, that's actually possibly more important information for me to know as your teacher or parent. And that's okay, because being a 1 or 2 is part of the journey. What's important, and this is back to executive dysfunction, is recognizing when you are and then taking the appropriate steps to progress, right? It's not like, oh, I'm a 1.
Yeah.
Bummer to be you. Moving on to the next lesson. It's not that kind of thing, but it's in that sense too, with this executive functioning work, what I like to explain to teachers when we look at accountability, which is one of the 6 factors in this program, Organized Binder, or the unpack of my book, is that it's really a co-accountability, kind of between 3 of us: family, I'm your teacher, and then you, because accountability, what I like to say is it's kind of 2 things. It's something that caring adults do for young people and that young people learn to do for themselves over time. And so there's an invitation to your action in this as well, in this executive functioning work.
That self-assessment piece is huge. I talk a lot about that in a variety of different settings. And being able to give kids that autonomy and agency to reflect is just really a powerful tool. Mitch, as we wrap up our conversation today, I would love to ask you one last question. If you were talking to someone who is just starting to think more intentionally about building executive functioning skills with the young people in their life, what is the first step? Like, what's one simple thing that you would suggest that they try, either in the classroom or at home?
Emily, I love that. I really do love that question. And I get that question a lot. And I've thought about it for a long time. And the answer is organization. I really believe this. I think there's something transformative and very grounding when humans figure out how to get, but also stay organized. The stay part's the important part, right? We can all clean your room. I can even come in and help you clean your room. But then I come back next month and we clean your room, like that's fine. But we're missing something there. It's the same thing if you could all the listeners visualize the book bag, and let's recognize that Google Classroom or whatever LMS you're using can be the digital version of the book bag. What I like about the book bag is I can see it all, hence the analog. It's just a starting place. It's a good place to start. But can I tell a story real quick?
Of course.
It won't take too long. I tell this story in the book as well. I had a student who, was just a holdout in terms of Organized Binder. And, I'm like the binder guy, and I'm still in the classroom. My school had adopted this program, more or less school-wide. And, this kid was like, I have what I'm doing, and I'm not buckling. And here was this kid's routine. They had a 3-inch binder. And again, I tell the story in more detail in the book. And that binder supposedly housed all of their class work for all of their classes. And the student kind of carried it around almost like a baby because it was so huge. And in the binder, they'd come in, they'd set it on the lab table. In my class, I taught 9th grade science most of my career, and make this big thud and open up this binder, and the student would pull out 2 inches of stuff, paper, documents, who knows. And it was every day. Talk about routine. Stick it in one side of the binder under it, and then start frantically looking through the other inch of stuff that's in the binder to find the stuff that we're doing. And I had finally had enough. And I said, okay, listen. And my students all sat in lab tables. So it's like stations of 4. Really interactive. And I went back into my storeroom and I got 4 binders for her, organized binders. And I gave one to each of the kids, one to her. And I said, I want all of you to go through the pile. And for the 4 kind of content classes that I know you're in, probably math, English, science, history, whatever, just make 4 piles. just by subject. Don't worry about it. And then once you've done that, let me know. And it took just a matter of minutes, really quick. And I said, okay, for the other classes, just put them in the binder. Let's set that off to the side. For this class, let's get this binder set up. Well, keep in mind, and I handed my class sample binder, but all 3 of those other students had their binder, right, neatly organized because we use it every day in this routine. And that's the other thing is a disorganized student, in this case, is less likely to engage with the learning community because they can't find their stuff, right? And if that stuff in your binder, in an organized binder, we call them system files, we're using those every single day. And so if you can't find yours, it's an engagement issue. So anyway, fast forward. I think, Emily, it was 10 minutes all in from the start to finish of this. And the student raised their hand for me to come over and take a look when they got them. And I, kind of with my elbow on her shoulder said, way to go. Good job. And I knew you could do it. And the student looked up at me and patted to her chest, kind of like motioning like this. And she said, Mr. Weathers, I actually feel better. Like I feel better. And I'm like, I know. That setup you have is not helping you in a lot of ways. And that experience, when I say like getting organized is grounding for young people, especially if they're struggling with executive functioning, it's the starting place. Okay, so now from here, if we want to look at even how it impacts the grade book, I'll keep it in the schooling side. I think this is absolutely true of home in terms of organization. And I can show you data, the impact on just grades, number of passing students when students learn to get and stay organized because they're finding stuff that's completed and not turned in, or things like, right? So it starts to impact a lot of these other executive functioning skills when I have this foundation of organization. So that's, I think, the starting place.
Mitch Weathers, author of Executive Functions for Every Classroom. Thanks for talking to me today.
Thanks, Emily. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
We talk a lot about helping kids succeed, but the truth is we don't always agree on what success looks like. For some, it's academic, good grades, finished homework, a clean desk. But for a lot of neurodivergent students, success might look very different. It might be remembering to bring a folder to school every day for a week. It might be writing down a due date in a planner, or managing frustration when a schedule changes. These wins are often invisible. They don't show up on a report card, and they don't get celebrated at the school assembly. But they matter because they represent growth in the kinds of skills that don't just help kids get through school, they help them navigate life. Executive functioning is often described as a soft skill, but there's nothing soft about learning to manage your time, break down a big task, or stay calm when things feel overwhelming. These are life skills, survival skills. And when we teach them intentionally in ways that work with neurodivergent brains and recognize the small, meaningful victories along the way, we're shifting the definition of success to be more inclusive, more realistic, and more human. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thank you to Mitch Weathers. If you'd like more info about his work or some of the things we discussed on this episode, you can find links in the show notes. Mental health professionals, don't forget, on April 25th, we're offering a free 1-hour continuing education webinar entitled The Cost of Camouflage, Exploring Masking and Burnout in Neurodivergent Clients. You can register at neurodiversity.university. Just click the Therapist Hub tab or find a link in the show notes. Also, if you haven't done it, you're invited to join our Facebook group and follow our Facebook page. Links to all of our social media spaces, you guessed it, in the show notes. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is the office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening. And we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance,